right, House of the Dragon, Season 1. Spoiler warning, I'm going to spoil everything through this season. Now, in this season, we're going way back before the original Game of Thrones show. In fact, 172 years before Daenerys, as the opening credits so clearly told us. And we're back in Westeros, this time following the saga of the Targaryen family. And we are witnessing a new power struggle, this time between the Blacks, which is Rhaenyra and her side, and the Greens, who is Alicent and her side. The first half of the season is spent following the younger versions of Rhaenyra and Alicent, and then the later half of the season is following the adult versions of those two characters, plus their children. Rhaenyra and Alicent start off as great friends, but then by the end of the season, event after event had occurred, which has brought them really far apart from each other and potentially ready to be at war with each other. Now, this is all based on the book Fire and Blood, which George R.R. Martin published, I think, around 2018. Apparently, he took a break from writing The Winds of Winter to write this book once it became apparent that HBO actually was going to likely want to make a show based on this story. And this book is written more as a history book, recapping the history of the Targaryen dynasty. It's not the traditional character-driven style of writing like his Game of Thrones books. This is more like I'm reading an encyclopedia. It is said to have been written actually a while after the events had occurred by mostly men who may or may not have had the actual details of the story right, and may have even been slightly biased in their telling of history, like in the real world. And so then this show is being presented as the real version of the events that happened in Fire and Blood. I think this is a pretty interesting way to do it. I have not read Fire and Blood, but apparently there are some events that happen in the show that are different from Fire and Blood. One example is that in the book, Laenor is dead, or at least that's what history has recorded. And in the show, we see that, oh, actually, he is alive. But it's a pretty cool setup because you can have the book, which is the history, which may or may not actually be true, and then the show, which is true, at least in terms of the Game of Thrones universe. And so actually, both of these things can coexist and not directly conflict with each other. All right, a couple of other notes about the show. First, the viewership was actually really good, apparently. It actually peaks around 10 million viewers per episode, and that's actually compared to about 4 million viewers per episode for the episode 1 of Game of Thrones and then the season finale of season 1. And then the other note about the show is that George R.R. Martin apparently was involved. He's credited as an executive producer, and it's not completely clear how much he was involved, but apparently he was reviewing rough cuts of the show, involved early in the writing process and some of the writing decisions, and just seems like he was actually explicitly brought into the process by the showrunners, and maybe even more involved than in the show Game of Thrones, where the rumor at least is that the showrunners really did not want him to be involved very much in the show. Don't know if that's true or not, but he seems fairly involved, and there's actually a video that I will link below where he is doing an interview and he is talking about his involvement in the show and his excitement around the show, and so it might be a good watch for you. As far as my own experience watching this, I am one of the many people who was slightly disappointed by season 8 of Game of Thrones. I didn't hate it as much as others did, but I was definitely disappointed. And in the time since that season was released, my appreciation for that season has actually grown. Part of me wants to go rewatch that season again, but that's another tangent I could go into. But the point is, I entered the House of the Dragon show a little bit skeptical around whether they were going to be able to make a good season. But I have to say that I was immediately hooked. I immediately thought it was great, and I am really glad that I watched it. So let's start off with what I liked about the season. From episode 1, it just seems like we were really getting back into Westeros. You had dragons flying through the air, you had the violence of this tournament, you had all this drama around who was going to be the heir, and you even had the explicit tie to the White Walkers in the Song of Ice and Fire at the end of the first episode, which that could have been a really clumsy reference to the show to try to drum up some nostalgia, but I actually liked the tie and the way that they did it. But I left that first episode thinking, wow, we are back in the land of Game of Thrones, this is awesome. You know, they changed the showrunners, and I thought, well, maybe it was the magic of the original showrunners, but this showed me that, hey, actually, it wasn't the showrunners, this can be done by other people. From then on, there were just several things that kept me coming back to the series. The first was the look of the show, just every vista, every costume, the lighting and the design, it's all just really beautiful. A lot of it looks like a painting on the screen. For instance, in episode 2, where they go to Dragonstone, when I first saw that, I thought, wow, this is so much better than what I remember when they showed the same environment in Game of Thrones. Fun fact, I'm also watching the companion behind the scenes series that they posted on HBO right after the season finale ended, where they talk about how they made Dragonstone, and apparently they're using the technology called the volume, which is basically this setup of a bunch of LED screens all around you, which help give the right lighting and give you a visual reference to what the surroundings are going to look like when you're actually on set. So if you're curious to learn more, I would definitely check out that series. But just the visuals and all of this was amazing. A couple other things, I love the fact that we got to see so many more dragons. Some of the props were also pretty amazing. Like at the end of the last episode, you get the painted table, the map table and Dragonstone, and they light it up with the candles, and it was just like, wow, this is amazing. I want that table in my house. So really high production value. The money is on the screen. They actually spent about $20 million per episode for this season. And that's more than Game of Thrones, which is more like $6 to $15 million per episode throughout the show's run. But they spent every dollar very well. Overall, I just have to say that I love the fact that there is this fantasy show that is being put in the mainstream and having so much care put into it. And at the time of this show, we get 2 fantasy shows. We also get Rings of Power. And so for all the nerds out there, this is just nirvana. Another thing I loved about this season is just the writing and the drama, especially in episode 7 where Aemond loses an eye and then Alicent goes nuts and she's like, give me his eye. And Aemond is like, I lost an eye, but I gained a dragon. That was one of the first episodes where I thought, hey, this investment that they have made early in the season of having us get to know these characters over time and all the time jumps. That was the first time I thought, hey, this is worth it, because they have all this character development that has allowed us to really make this point be impactful. And then another favorite moment of drama is actually at the end where Luke and Aemond are in their dragon fight. I love the shot of foreshadowing where Luke is arriving and he sees Vhagar in the distance. It's like a scene from Jurassic Park. And then the dragon battle, and then the tragedy of Aemond basically making a mistake and killing Luke and probably starting a war if it wasn't started already. Another thing I loved about the show was Lord Corlys and the Valyrians. I'll admit it, I'm just glad that they made them black. I talk about this in my Rings of Power video where they also at least tried to pay some attention to racial diversity. I applaud them, especially given that this is a time where it's medieval Europe and black people weren't necessarily in these positions. But I heard an interview somewhere where the showrunners basically just said, hey, I just don't want to make another show where it's all white people. So who is my favorite character? I have to say probably Rhaenys. She's just one of the few characters that I feel good about in this series, or at least as good as you can about a Game of Thrones House of the Dragon character. She's super smart, she's badass, she seems like she wants the right thing for the realm. The one thing that I have not quite forgiven her for is where she comes out of the floor with her dragon, which was an amazing scene, but she kills all of those peasants. And it's just like, wow, did she care about any of those people? And then maybe a final thing that I loved about the show was just the theme of patriarchy and what it can do. You have all of this drama spun up by the imperative for Viserys to have an heir, and the fact that, no, you can't have a female heir, it's gotta be male heir. And it basically drives Viserys to get his wife killed. And then this whole tension of the succession basically ruins the relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra and starts a war. So just, I think, some pretty good commentary on that theme. Now, there are a couple of interesting questions that I think the show raises, which I have been pondering back and forth. The first is, I assume that we are heading towards a war, and there's a really interesting question of when did the war start? When was it inevitable? It's amazing to think about how this series of just unfortunate and in some cases stupid events could lead to a cascade of things that you can't control anymore. It actually makes me want to study some of the other wars that have happened in real life, because I bet that there is a similar series of events that have led to some of those. But my question is, when would you say the war was inevitable in House of the Dragon? Was it when Aemond and Vhagar accidentally kill Luke? I mean, I'm pretty sure that war is certain after that. But you can also take a step back and say, well, maybe it was actually when Viserys dies and a lot of people think the succession is a bit iffy and the Greens decide to usurp the throne. Maybe that's when the war started. Maybe it's that moment I talked about earlier when Aemond loses his eye and Alicent is like, give me Luke's eye in return. Maybe it was when Aegon was born, creating this tension because now you have him and you have Rhaenyra who is heir, and now there's a question of who should actually be heir. Or maybe it was just when Viserys decided to name Rhaenyra the heir in the first place. This seems like something that this country was never going to accept, and so maybe war was actually inevitable from that point. So anyway, I think it's just really interesting to think about when it started in that whole thought experiment. The second question is green or black? Which team are you on? Who do you think is in the right, or at least more in the right? You know, you have the arguments for Team Green, which is that Rhaenyra is a hot mess. Basically, she just does whatever she wants without any punishment. She really doesn't treat Criston Cole very well. She's having all sorts of kids out of wedlock, and it's really not a smart move, especially the way that she did it, where she's basically having these kids with someone who's a different color from her actual husband and just expecting that everyone's going to be okay with that. It's like, you could have predicted that that was going to be an issue. And then the last argument for Team Green, at least in my opinion, is that Alicent actually does believe that Viserys' dying wish was to have Aegon be the heir. And clearly she's wrong, but she believes that, and so maybe she is just acting on what she believes. So as far as arguments for Team Black, well, Alicent is also a hot mess. Maybe the peak is again when she asked for Luke's eye, which I know I keep going back to, but it's like, wow. I mean, you could argue that Alicent has gone through a lot of crap in her life, and so it makes sense that she would break, but still, she is not quite stable. And then the other thing is that Rhaenyra just seems like she would be a much better ruler. She was the one who was actually named. At least by the end of the season, she seems like she has the skills and temperament to be a ruler, that she wants the right things for the realm. I will note that this transformation basically happens in the last episode, where suddenly she's awesome at being a queen. Before, again, I'll say she was a little bit of a mess. But anyway, for all those reasons, I have to say that at least at this moment, I am Team Black. But we will see how that changes over time. So those were some things that I liked about the show. What would I change about the show? The main thing that I would at least consider changing is the time jumps, and particularly the time jump that is between 5 and 6, where they have aged up most of the characters and recast a lot of people. I did find that mid-season time jump a little bit jarring when I first saw it. They introduced so many new characters, so many new kids. The new Rhaenyra and Alicent actresses, while they were great, they didn't at first to me seem extremely consistent with the previous actresses. And then we had all these characters, and I didn't quite understand all the motivations for some of the actions that they were taking in that episode 6. For instance, why exactly did Rhaenyra shack up with this new knight and have all these kids out of wedlock? You know, why should we care about the Strongs? It seems like there must be a whole story there, but because of how they've structured the season, we just don't really get to go into it. And so then when the Strongs are burned to death in the episode, it's not as impactful as it maybe could have been. In other words, the whole motivation behind Laena and her character and why she chose to just kill herself at the end when she was going through this whole pregnancy scare. Again, kind of makes sense, but I feel like I missed years and years of character development that would have really made that moment land a lot better. And then also Larys Strong, why is he such a creepster? I mean, we had some foreshadowings of that in the earlier episodes, but he decides like, oh, I'm gonna just kill my brother and father. And again, I bet that there's a whole story there of how he got to that place. And it was also interesting just the logic of how they chose which actors to recast versus not. Like, they recast Rhaenyra and they recast Alicent, but Criston Cole is the same actor, so he looks actually the same age even though like 10 years has passed. So that was a little bit distracting at first. But I have to say that I felt this way a little bit during episode 6. I still loved episode 6, by the way, but felt a little bit jarring. And then by episode 7, I was totally back into the game. I was loving the new actresses that were cast, and I was just fine with the time jumps. And, you know, I have some empathy for the show creators because there is a real question around where you should start with a story like this. Apparently, the book Fire and Blood goes way back before the events of this season, starting, I think, with Aegon's conquest of Westeros. So you could argue that you should start way back there. Or you could also argue that you should start way later. Maybe you should just start when King Viserys dies, because that is, you know, one of the key inciting incidents of this entire war. And apparently, in the future seasons, it's going to be more of a story of Rhaenyra and Alicent's children versus Rhaenyra and Alicent themselves. And so you could say, well, maybe all the backstory of Rhaenyra and Alicent could have just been flashbacks, and then you wouldn't have needed all of these time jumps. But I have to say, I actually really like the way that they did it. I like that we got to see the growing up of Rhaenyra and Alicent and how their friendship turned, because I do feel a lot more invested in all of the characters in the story because of all that backstory. So what's the one change I would maybe make if I could? It would probably just be to add an episode or two between 5 and 6, giving us a little more background on some of those characters that I mentioned, the Strongs, Laena, filling in a little bit of the gaps. All right, so the other thing I would consider changing is actually just the rough childbirth scenes that they have. I'm really torn, and I'm not really sure what to do with this, because on the one hand, these scenes are important to the series. They are really trying to land this point of childbirth being very dangerous back then, and how the patriarchy, again, basically was oppressive to these women. And so I like that they showed that. On the other hand, I'm not gonna lie, watching those scenes was a lot, especially the one in episode 1 where Emma dies. That was really hard to watch, and there were times where I actually wanted to go back and rewatch episode 1 and maybe rewatch the whole series because I liked it so much. But I was like, man, I don't know if I can watch that scene again. I have to say, I did go back and rewatch episode 1 and episode 2, and I'm rewatching the series right now, and so I'm over it. But it was pretty brutal, and I just wonder if they should have handled it differently, though I don't know what I would have changed. All right, so what did I think of the show overall? Again, I really loved it. For this season, I would give it a 5 out of 5 stars. I think that this is close to a perfect season of television, and I think that's especially remarkable given that they needed to kind of come back from what happened in season 8 of Game of Thrones. And I think they succeeded. I am eagerly awaiting season 2. Apparently it is not going to come out next year. Apparently the earliest it's going to come out is probably 2024. And so I hope they hurry up and make it. All right, that'll do it for this video. I'd love to hear what you thought about this season. And so if you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the like button, which will help others find it, and subscribe for more. Peace.